January 31, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon. The tropical air shimmered in the sunlight as Major Frank T. McCoy walked across the silent airfield. The war had torn the Philippines apart, but what stood before him was untouched: a complete Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber. Its smooth aluminum fuselage gleamed like polished silver, and its engines looked ready to roar again. Yet the Japanese crew had abandoned it without a fight. When McCoy's inspection team opened the access panels, what they found defied all logic. The fuel tanks, massive, spanning each wing, were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber, no armor, not even a thin protective coating. Just fragile aluminum separating thousands of liters of high-octane fuel from enemy gunfire. It was a death trap built to fly farther than any bomber in the world. And this single discovery would expose the design philosophy that doomed Japan's air power. McCoy had examined dozens of wrecks before, but never one so complete. Every bolt and panel told a story of precision and of peril. What American engineers soon realized was that this design wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Japan's quest for range and speed had led it to sacrifice the very thing Western pilots valued most: survival. 4 years earlier, this same aircraft had been a terror of the skies. On December 8, 1941, the morning after Pearl Harbor, squadrons of G-4M Betty bombers roared out of Formosa toward Clark Field, the heart of American air power in the Philippines. At 12:35 p.m., they arrived in perfect formation at 20,000 feet, beyond the reach of U.S. anti-aircraft fire. Within minutes, hundreds of bombs rained down. Runways erupted in fire. Hangars collapsed. 17 B-17 flying fortresses sat helpless below. 12 were destroyed outright. Those who survived remembered the scene with disbelief. The bombers flew with calm precision, untouchable, while Zero fighters swept low to finish the slaughter. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines ceased to exist. The attack's success stunned Allied commanders. The Japanese had struck from 460 miles away, a range no American bomber could dream of matching. 2 days later, the same Bettys struck again, this time against the British warships Prince of Wales and Repulse. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. Both capital ships, symbols of British naval might, lay at the bottom of the South China Sea. It was the first time in history that heavily armed battleships defending themselves at sea were sunk entirely by aircraft. Japan had proven what military theorists had only imagined: that air power alone could dominate the oceans. Through early 1942, the Betty's reach seemed limitless. From the Philippines to Darwin, from New Guinea to the Solomon Islands, it struck targets thousands of miles apart. Allied forces couldn't respond. The bomber's range gave Japan complete control of the Pacific's vast distances. For 6 months, it looked unstoppable. But hidden inside that gleaming fuselage was a flaw that would soon consume it. The Betty's strength, its speed and range, came from what it lacked: protection. Every kilogram saved from armor was poured into fuel. Every inch of weight removed became extra distance it could fly. Japanese engineers had built a masterpiece of efficiency, but one that burned like a torch when struck. By mid-1942, the balance began to shift. The Allies fielded new fighters: Hellcats, Corsairs, Lightnings, faster, tougher, and flown by better-trained pilots. When they finally met the Betty in the skies over Guadalcanal, the illusion of Japanese invincibility vanished in fire. On August 8, 1942, 23 Bettys took off from Rabaul to strike American positions. 18 never returned. American pilots reported that the bombers ignited with only a few hits. 2 or 3 bullets through the wing, and the whole aircraft exploded. The flying cigar became known as the one-shot lighter, or simply the flying Zippo. From then on, Betty formations were hunted mercilessly. Every interception ended the same way, with fireballs tumbling into the sea. When Allied engineers examined captured aircraft, they confirmed what the pilots had seen. The Betty's fuel tanks were completely bare. No self-sealing layers, no insulation, no armor plating. A single burst of tracer fire could ignite thousands of liters of fuel in seconds. The design saved over 500 kilograms of weight, enough for extra fuel and range, but at the cost of almost every crew that flew it. The story of how such a decision came to be began years before the war. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a requirement that no other nation dared attempt: a bomber capable of flying nearly 4,800 kilometers, carrying heavy bombs or torpedoes, and outrunning enemy fighters. Japan's empire stretched across half the Pacific. Its naval planners believed that only such a long-range bomber could connect and defend it. At Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant, chief designer Kiro Honjo was given an impossible task. With limited engine power and technology, he faced a brutal equation. The only way to achieve the Navy's range demands was to make the aircraft lighter than any bomber of its size. Fuel weighed tons. Protection weighed tons. Something had to go. Honjo chose to remove the armor. His reasoning was chillingly logical. If range could win the war quickly, protection wouldn't matter. The Betty would strike before enemies could react. Its speed and distance would be its defense. The gamble worked, for a time. When the war began, the Betty's 6,000-kilometer range gave Japan unmatched striking power. But as the war dragged on, those same design choices turned deadly. By late 1942, the Pacific skies became a graveyard of burning aluminum. Crews knew the odds. A hit to the wings meant death. There were no wounded, no crash landings, only explosions. Surviving pilots described flying the Betty as a mission of fate. One Japanese officer later said, "It was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range." In 1943, desperate engineers added 30mm rubber sheets under the wings, a crude attempt at fuel protection. It slowed leaks, but couldn't stop fire. Speed dropped, range shortened, and losses continued. A true self-sealing system wasn't added until the G4M Model 3 in 1944. By then, far too late. Barely 60 of these improved aircraft were built before Japan's defeat. The Betty's weakness became infamous in one of the war's most precise ambushes. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. American codebreakers intercepted his flight plan. He would be traveling in a Betty from Rabaul to Bougainville. On April 18, 1943, 18 P-38, Lightnings flew 400 miles at wavetop height to intercept. At exactly 9:34 a.m., they arrived, 1 minute early. Within moments, Yamamoto's bomber was hit in the wing tanks. The aircraft erupted in flames and crashed into the jungle. There were no survivors. The same design that gave Japan its early victories ensured its greatest leader's death. By 1945, the Betty's role had turned tragic. The once proud bomber was now used to carry kamikaze weapons, the manned rocket called Oka. Heavy and unstable, these missions were nearly suicidal. On March 21, 1945, 18 Bettys carrying Oka rockets took off to attack the U.S. fleet off Okinawa. American fighters intercepted them long before they reached release range. Every single bomber was shot down. Not one Oka was launched. 152 men died in a mission doomed before it began. And then, in the war's final days, the Betty returned for one last flight, not as a weapon, but as a messenger of surrender. On August 19, 1945, two white-painted Betty bombers bearing green crosses lifted off from Japan, carrying envoys to meet Allied officers and arrange the terms of peace. The same aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field now carried Japan's surrender. The circle had closed. Out of more than 2,400 Betty bombers built, almost none survived. The Pacific's skies consumed them, victims of their own design. Their fuel tanks had bought them distance, but that distance had been paid for with human lives. The Betty became not just a weapon, but a symbol of Japan's flawed philosophy of war. While American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-25 Mitchell grew heavier with armor and self-sealing systems, Japanese doctrine viewed protection as unnecessary weight. The U.S. could afford slower, sturdier aircraft because it had the industrial might to replace them. Japan could not. Its engineers designed for the short war they expected, not the long one they got. In the end, the numbers told the story. For every Betty lost, an entire crew vanished. There were no survivors, no wounded veterans returning home, only photographs and memories of blazing aircraft falling into the sea. Allied reports called them easy kills, but the truth was far more tragic. These crews knew exactly what awaited them, and still they flew. Major McCoy's discovery at Clark Field wasn't just a technical revelation. It was the physical proof of Japan's fatal miscalculation, the belief that victory could be achieved by range alone. The Betty had been brilliantly engineered for a war that existed only on paper. Once confronted by the relentless reality of American air power, that brilliance turned into a curse. From the first bombs over the Philippines to the green-crossed bombers of surrender, the Betty story mirrors Japan's own wartime journey. Bold, daring, and doomed by overconfidence, it showed the world that performance without protection is an illusion, and that no amount of engineering genius can overcome a misunderstanding of war itself.
The Betty was not a failure of design. It was the perfect embodiment of Japan's philosophy, one that prized reach over life and speed over survival. It achieved everything its creators demanded, and in doing so, it destroyed the men who flew it. When historians look back on the Pacific War, they see many causes for Japan's defeat: industrial weakness, strategic overreach, and flawed leadership. But perhaps none is as haunting as this: the unarmored wings of a bomber that could fly across the Pacific, but could never fly home.